in Black Protestant churches. You'd have examples of, say, Coptic theology being used in Black Protestant religious culture, particularly in relation to the struggle against fascist Italy and things of that nature. And so, even though these groups were nominally Protestant, they often were not just it wasn't kind of mainline Protestant theology. And again, because the pastors often did not have formal religious training, and because the denominational structures were so weak in many ways, and because many of these churches, and in many churches, I mean, the pastor, if the congregation did not like what the pastor was saying, the pastor would be gone. And this is one thing that really frustrated a lot of Black social scientists, because they would go to churches, and Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Benjamin Mays, a lot of them wrote about how it seemed to them that the churches were railing against the wrong things. They were, as Kanye would say, worried about the wrong things. There was a sense that, that they were railing against like social dancing, but they wouldn't be railing against say, women having children outside of marriage or something. And they thought that, dancing, it's not railing against dancing and playing sports, and rail against this. But that's an example of just how just kind of idiosyncratic, different that these churches were. And part of it was because the lack of strong denominational structure made the congregations, I think, very powerful and able to really, even though churches, and this is, I think, is an important difference in the South and the North. I'm still trying to figure out, as I do think that the pastors do become more powerful in the North for certain reasons that are important to follow up on. But a lot of the kind of funkiness of the economic organization, I think, did maintain. That's one reason why a lot of the local banks are like, no, we're out. The homeowners organizations can try to integrate their leadership if they want, but we're gone. And so yeah. So Protestant is I think a questionable label in that regard for a lot of those reasons. There is a lot of affinity for that in that way with some of these other groups, even though they would often oppose those groups, with their rhetoric.
Yeah. John, and then was there one more question? Maybe? Was there a hand back there?
I'm
okay, so maybe two more questions, and then we can kind of open up for informal talks and discussions. Does that sound good? Anyone's got one they're holding on to?
Okay. In his autobiography, James Boggs has this virulent hatred for churches. He talks about his sort of hatred for the church, both in Detroit and in, I think, Alabama, where he's from. And his story is that, the Alabama church functions kind of like what you said, right, as a kind of adjunct to the Jim Crow system, agricultural sharecropping, and kind of he sees it as kind of playing this role. There and in Detroit, right, as well. The function of the church is to kind of, they make people kind of accept their fate rather than fight or whatever. And that's very common probably among other radicals at the time, although I'm sure there's interesting differences among like Black radicals in the 60s over this question. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that question of like the anti-church versus the kind of radical church.
Sure, yeah. I think that in places like in Chicago, for example, the Baptist hierarchy was very much tied to Richard Daley in many ways. It was led by Joseph H. Jackson, who begins as a kind of social gospel idealist in the early part of the 20th century, and would say things like, the ideal way of organizing the world would be somewhere between capitalism and Soviet communism. He had a lot of kind of funky ideas, actually, that do illustrate some of the differences between what's often thought of as prophetic politics and, say, messianism, in that he was basically a follower of Booker T. Washington in a lot of ways. But he, in the 1950s, takes a trip to the Soviet Union. He goes with a kind of delegation of American pastors of the Soviet Union, and he writes a book about it. And he basically says that, and this is 1955, 55 or 56 when the book comes out. So this is kind of after McCarthyism in a certain sense, but very much still in an anti-communist situation. The book has no critiques of communism, or even critiques of the political organization of the Soviet Union. He says that the communists were right to drive out the Tsar, and they were right to drive out the religious hierarchy that supported the Tsar. And he has a section called "Some Critiques of Soviet Communism," and you're getting up and you're thinking, oh, well, here we go. And literally all the critiques have to do with the fact that even though it was good that they got rid of the Orthodox establishment in Russia, they went a little bit too far. But he argued it was okay now because now, I guess by implication under Khrushchev, Soviet communism is beginning to rebloom. And he says that the churches that he went to in Russia reminded him a lot of the churches that he grew up in rural Alabama. And for him, this is important because in the event of a nuclear apocalypse, it's going to be important for a messianic remnant to exist somewhere. And maybe that place is going to be in Soviet Russia. How ironic would that be? And so because of that argument, the book is not really interested in the West versus the East or anything like that at all. It's really just interested in this messianic remnant. But that gives you an example of how, even though this guy became incredibly conservative. By the 80s, his sermons literally could have been right out of, say, the 1988 Republican National Convention or something, and he's railing against, just is anything that, say, Jerry Falwell or any of those people would be railing against. Somewhat remarkably, it's not even, he's railing against big taxation. It's just kind of this Republican boilerplate by that point. But before then, there was a capacity for this kind of idiosyncratic thinking. But yeah, very much so. He ran the Baptist Church out of Chicago as a kind of subsidiary of the Daley regime. He would help Daley punish churches that tried to align with the king in different kinds of ways. And so those churches were very powerful, but there were movements within black religious culture in Chicago that were against that, and the Storefronts were one of those. And the Storefronts were not under that kind of control. They fought even the Baptist Storefronts fought Joseph Jackson's power in the 1960s. But ultimately you could argue that the city won, although Joseph Jackson's church also closed due to these transformations. And so that's one of the things that's so interesting about this is that the people who, aside from the true city powers, all the people who oppose the Storefronts ultimately are also defeated by the city at some point, often just a few years after they defeat the Storefronts. And so, they might win in 68, 69, they're out of the neighborhood by the 70s. Their churches are also closed down by the 90s. So it tells you something about the limitations of a certain kind of compromise. So yeah.
Please join me in thanking. Did you have a lesson?
Yeah. Maybe that's the lesson for today. Kingsley asked for a lesson for today. Maybe that's the lesson.
Oh yeah.
Well, I had a question.
Yeah.
My question wasn't fully answered, because I was also talking about a dichotomous relationship when it came to storefront churches and other minority groups like Hispanics.
Oh yes, right.
I was saying, all right, do you see a similar phenomenon with Hispanic communities when it comes to migration from the South or from southern areas to the north or to cities, more urban areas, when it comes to lack of access to assets, housing, or is it some other type of situation where it is other governmental provisions that assist, which makes the social organization in society, Chicago more integrated and multicultural. I wanted to know, for instance, I know many of my Hispanic friends, they are Catholic. So they may have only just went to Catholic church. I don't know, So I just wanted to know that relationship with other minorities and how they utilize storefront churches as well.
Sure. I don't know a lot about that that relationship. I guess I would say that it is interesting to think about the difference in eras because when this was going on. Black people in Chicago were much more segregated than Mexicans in Chicago were. And then later, it seems that the city intentionally, for example, puts like Little Village, like where they do, as part of their attempt to just kind of control the black-white relationship, spatial relationship in the city. That's what I've heard some people say. And then, I mean, if you listen to, say, Rahm Emanuel, he will often, you can say this is part of, divide and conquer and other things, but he will say things like the Latino community in Chicago is so organized. They have family values. They value their neighborhoods, and the implicit and implicitly it's unlike the black people, and so that's of course not to say that say botanicas and other kinds of kind of grassroots Latinx religious organization have not come under a lot of similar kinds of pressures, but the way that the city thinks about them is probably different in certain ways that I think are important to think about, even if that difference is often more about kind of about this kind of, I don't know, divide and conquer is kind of a lazy way to think about it in some ways, but an attempt to build a rhetoric that can say that, we're going to uplift these people in certain kinds of political moments to do certain work for us, even if we're not really doing that in a broader sense. It's kind of like what Daley did and his people did during this whole situation, where they would align themselves with their political opponents against the storefronts, even though long term they very much wanted the destruction of these essentially integrated neighborhoods. And so I think it's important to kind of pay attention to the differences. But yeah, it's not a subject that I really know that much about at this point, but it's a very important one. So yeah, thanks for raising it.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Kai for an amazing talk. Very quick, there's a couple events coming up. Did you want to plug the Peter Cole one real quick, or just
Dates?
Next weekend, a week from today, same time,
Same time,
place.
same place. Here next week we'll talk about 1919 with Franklin Cozy Gay and Peter Cole, and I'll say something too, and we'll have another similar talk.
And then on
the riots in 1919.
Yeah. And then on the 12th of December, there's some flyers floating around, I think still up on the table. There's a talk from some comrades who are coming on a little Midwest tour from Olympia, Washington, some good friends of ours who did a sort of reading group over the course of a year or two on strategy and ended up making a small book of texts that they introduced and organized, and they're touring around to talk about the book, and it's I think it's going to be really useful and cool opportunity to also just hear about what's happening on the West Coast, because comrades don't often make it out here that far, and these folks have been very invested in building autonomous networks and power and engaged in anti-fascist and eco-defense work out there as well, so it's an opportunity to learn about what's happening on the other side of the country too. So yeah, that's on the 12th. That's going to be at Floods Hall in Hyde Park at 7 p.m. Yeah. Was there anything else anyone needed to know?
Is the email listing or something you can sign up to?
We do
Right
that.
over here?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's an email list. Great. All right, well, thanks a lot. Thanks again for Tammy for hosting and for the wonderful food.
Thanks. I like it. Yeah, no, I do too.
We've already cleared out one more train.
Good. My point is, if you want to
I used to stay over there on 73rd and and that's right on South Shore. But I'll say like most of those storefronts over there,
well, that's what I want to talk. Yeah, I agree. What does that mean?
yeah, it's like what's the legacy connected to that?
Today, yeah. What does it mean?
We haven't discussed it.
Maybe not. You've said sort of nothing.
Maybe it needs to be some.
You're pretty shaky. I know that.
Whoa.
Stick around for a little bit.
Runner Steve, he's fascinated with the chicken. He's the one over there that's got the sign.
It's like, here you go. The dress is more or less so it's been so I told him about this sign, and he looked in, and he ditched my electric. Hey, just let me get it. It's sort of a joke. I was a long time ago. I was giving a talk, I think, at a month.
Steve probably does. Actually, my team is there for the white flag. So we get a very interesting
It's a really interesting. The then editor sometimes front section. He described me as like a colour, so I still like
I want to make sure you know this. I know he's just done some great.
Anyway, so we go maybe a nice little book with all
Yeah, no, it's really attractive. I mean, that's one thing I've been trying to figure out, just kind of figure out what's cool stuff in Southern City. And, you know, there's like different question about resources. This question about, yeah, what are the ways what is thought to be?
I will bet any white guy.
Wait, what did Jim show?
Absolutely. Totally. No, I know very well. So I don't know if you heard a couple of years ago on WBZ, they did a story on the Ginger market, and so I took Monica to Southtown South, actually. I've been to probably 47, probably 50 places now. And I go every single one. So I go in, order the gym shoe, sit down and eat the thing. And some of them are awful. I mean, a bad gym shoe is horrible. Yeah, so much of the...
Thank you.
Man, I don't like that.
Thanks for that.
Then I go back to the window and say, that was a good sandwich. So, you know, gym shoe, that's a funny name. You know, where did it come from? A lot of times, half of the time, you're always like a totally different side of history. And I mean, it's always been called that. Well, I said, not always. Yeah, that's probably around the time of the war. But let me finish with Jim Shoe name. You'll like the story. So after I probably went 30 places, I get sick. I've been sick and getting nowhere. So it was actually at just south of here. It doesn't matter. So I went, ate my sandwich in the back. Where did the name come from? And the owner, really nice guy, talked to me, really nice guy. Didn't know, but he was telling me what he knew. And it just, a kid, might have been his son, came over and he was listening. And he said, I know where the name comes from. I thought, maybe that's part of the comes to your mind.
To build a dam. He's like, you're not sure, but it may have been timing. So, I mean, there is a kind of, and they finally land, and 113 is after the